When the night falls and the world grows silent, there's a place where your darkest fears come to life. A place where the line between dream and nightmare vanishes. Welcome to Nightmare Narratives, where every story drags you deeper into the abyss. The whispers you hear in the dead of night, the shadows that seem to shift when no one's looking, they're not just figments of your imagination. Here, in these twisted tales, you'll face the things that hide beneath your bed and the horrors that lurk just beyond your vision. What if the nightmares never ended when you woke up? What if waking up was the real nightmare all along? Brace yourself, because in Nightmare Narratives, your worst fears are only the beginning. When Greg invited us for a weekend on his family's private island, it seemed like the perfect escape, a chance to disconnect, relax, and enjoy nature. It was supposed to be the ideal break from the monotony of life in the city. Mark, Jay, and I had always been up for an adventure, and Greg knew that. But something in his eyes, something flickering just beneath the surface, gave me pause when he extended the invitation. It was fleeting, but it was there. A flicker of hesitation, a sliver of unease. "A private island?" Mark asked, smirking. "Sounds fancy. What's the catch?" "No catch," Greg replied, but his voice was too casual, too rehearsed. "You'll just have to see it for yourselves. It's different." That last word hung in the air, unsettling, ambiguous. Different could mean anything, and the way Greg said it only piqued my curiosity. But curiosity, as they say, can be dangerous. We set out early Friday morning, just as a thick fog rolled in over the sea, swallowing everything in its path. The boat cut through the mist, but it was as if we were moving in slow motion, the water barely rippling beneath us. The sky was a dull gray, casting an eerie light over the scene, and the laughter that had filled the boat earlier died away, leaving us in a thick silence. As we neared the island, I felt it, the first pang of dread. It started in my chest, a tightness I couldn't explain, and then it spread, curling its way through my body. The island loomed ahead, dark and jagged, like a fortress carved from the rock itself. The cliffs rose sharply from the sea, their edges blurred by the fog, and perched atop them was the mansion. It was old, much older than I had expected. Its stone walls were covered in creeping vines, and its windows were dark, like soulless eyes watching us as we approached. The closer we got, the heavier the air became. The fog seemed to press in on us, growing thicker, denser, until it felt like it was alive, curling around the boat, whispering in our ears. For a moment I could have sworn I saw shapes moving within it, shadows that flickered at the edge of my vision, just out of reach. When we finally docked, Greg's parents were waiting for us. But they weren't how I remembered them. They stood side by side, too still, too stiff, their faces pale and gaunt, as if the life had been drained from them. Their smiles were stretched too wide, forced, like they were trying to mimic expressions they no longer understood. "You're finally here," Greg's father said, his voice flat, lifeless. "The island's been waiting for you." "The island's been waiting for us?" The words chilled me to the core. I glanced at Greg, hoping he would explain, but he just nodded, his face unreadable. We followed his parents up the winding path toward the mansion, the fog swirling around us, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The trees that lined the path were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The further we went, the more it felt like we were walking into the belly of some great beast, and that tightness in my chest grew stronger with every step. The mansion towered over us as we approached, its windows still black, soulless. The front door creaked open as we neared it, groaning like a thing alive. The moment we crossed the threshold, the air changed. It was thick, heavy, almost oppressive. The smell hit me first, a mix of damp, mold, and something metallic, blood. It was faint, but it was there, lurking beneath the surface. The house was old, much older than I had imagined, and it groaned and creaked with every step we took. The floorboards beneath our feet felt unstable, like they were ready to give way at any moment. The walls seemed to lean in on us, the shadows growing longer and darker the deeper we ventured into the house. I could feel something watching us, something lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. Greg's parents disappeared into the house without a word, leaving us standing in the cavernous entrance hall. For a moment, none of us spoke. The air was too thick, too oppressive, pressing down on us like a weight. It felt as though we had stepped into another world, one that didn't want us there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house shifting and groaning around me. The room was freezing, the sheets damp and cold against my skin. Every creak, every groan set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was lurking just outside the door, waiting. And then I heard it, the whispers. At first they were faint, barely audible, like the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. But they grew louder, more insistent. They weren't coming from outside, they were coming from the walls themselves. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were everywhere, surrounding me, seeping through the floorboards, curling around me like a living thing. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel them, twisting and writhing in the air like serpents. They filled my head, making my skin crawl. I threw the covers off and stumbled out of bed, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I had to get out. I had to escape those whispers. But when I opened the door, I froze. Mark was standing at the end of the hallway, his back to me. His posture was rigid, unnatural, and his shadow stretched impossibly long across the floor, twisting into strange, grotesque shapes. His head was tilted at an odd angle, and his lips were moving, but the voice that came out wasn't his. "The island has claimed us," the voice rasped, deep and hollow. "We belong to it now." My heart stopped. I couldn't move. When Mark finally turned, I felt the blood drain from my face. His eyes, they weren't his. They were pale, cloudy, like the eyes of something dead. His skin was so pale it was almost translucent, stretched too tight over his bones. And then he smiled, a wide, unnatural smile that chilled me to the core. I slammed the door shut, backing away, my mind racing. What the hell had just happened? If the shadows are starting to feel a little too close, it's not just your imagination. Like this video and share it, because in nightmare narratives, the more eyes on these stories, the less alone you'll feel when the darkness comes creeping. The next morning, everything felt off. Mark was quiet, too quiet. He didn't speak much, just stared off into space, his eyes distant and glazed. There was something in the way he moved that unsettled me. His steps were slow, deliberate, as though he was listening to something we couldn't hear. Greg, too, seemed different. He was jumpy, constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting something to appear out of thin air. I tried to talk to him about what had happened the night before, but every time I brought it up, he would change the subject, his eyes darting nervously around the room. That afternoon, the four of us decided to explore the island. It was small, but dense with trees and thick underbrush. As we walked, the fog seemed to cling to us, swirling around our legs like smoke. The trees were twisted, gnarled, their branches knotted together in grotesque shapes. It was as though the island itself was alive, its very soil pulsing with an ancient, malevolent energy. We came across a clearing in the middle of the woods, an open space dominated by a single massive oak tree. Its trunk was twisted and gnarled, covered in strange symbols that looked ancient, almost runic. There was something about the tree that felt wrong, as though it was watching us. As we stood there, a cold wind blew through the clearing, and I could have sworn I heard the faint sound of whispers carried on the breeze. Greg didn't say a word, but I could tell he was tense, his eyes fixed on the tree, his fists clenched at his sides. It was as though the tree held some terrible secret, one that Greg knew but refused to share. We returned to the mansion as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the island. The air grew colder, the fog thickening once again, and that same oppressive feeling settled over us like a shroud. The house felt different too, darker. The whispers had returned, faint at first, but growing louder as the night wore on. They were no longer confined to the walls. They were in the air, surrounding us, pressing in on all sides. That night, the nightmares began. I dreamt of the island, of the tree in the clearing. In the dream, the tree was alive, its branches reaching out like arms, its bark splitting open to reveal a dark, gaping maw. I saw myself standing before it, helpless, as it devoured me whole. When I woke, drenched in sweat, I could still hear the whispers, louder now, more insistent. I tried to shake off the dream, but the feeling of dread clung to me like a second skin. Something was very, very wrong with this place. Over the next few days, Mark's condition worsened. His skin grew paler, almost translucent, and his eyes were completely white, empty. He stopped speaking altogether, only muttering to himself in that strange guttural language I had heard the night before. His behavior became more erratic. He would disappear for hours at a time, only to return with strange marks on his skin, his clothes torn and dirty. One night, I followed him. He left the mansion just after midnight, slipping out into the fog without a word. I trailed behind him, keeping my distance, my heart pounding in my chest. He moved through the trees with a strange, deliberate grace, as though he knew exactly where he was going. The fog seemed to part for him, swirling around him like a cloak, and as we reached the clearing, I saw him stop in front of the tree. For a long moment, he stood there, his head tilted back, staring up at the twisted branches, and then, without warning, he dropped to his knees, his hands pressed against the rough bark, his body shaking. I watched in horror as the symbols on the tree began to glow, faint at first, but growing brighter, casting an eerie light over the clearing. Mark let out a low, guttural moan, his body convulsing. His skin seemed to pulse, his veins dark and swollen beneath the surface. And then, as I stood frozen in place, the bark of the tree began to move, splitting open to reveal a dark, yawning void. Mark was pulled toward it, his body jerking violently as though something was dragging him into the darkness. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. I watched as Mark was swallowed whole, disappearing into the tree's gaping maw, and then the bark sealed itself shut, leaving no trace of him behind. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. What the hell had just happened? I wanted to run back to the mansion, to tell the others, but when I turned, I saw them, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. The figures were tall, their bodies shrouded in darkness, their faces hidden beneath hoods. I couldn't see their eyes, but I could feel them, cold and unfeeling, boring into me. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing through the trees, filling my head until I thought I would go mad. And then they were gone, as suddenly as they had appeared. I ran back to the mansion, my heart racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When I burst through the front door, Greg was waiting for me. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Can you sense the terror building? If you think you know what's coming next, leave a comment and let us know your theory, before the story gets its grip on you. Here in Nightmare Narratives, it's always too late to turn back, but maybe, just maybe, you'll see the danger before it sees you. "Where's Mark?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "What the hell is happening on this island?" Greg didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Guilt, fear, despair? "Tell me," I shouted, grabbing him by the shoulders. "Tell me what's going on." Greg's lips trembled, and for a moment I thought he would break down. But then he took a deep breath and pulled away from me. "The island, it's cursed," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been in my family for generations. The tree in the clearing, it's a portal, a doorway to something dark, something ancient. The island feeds on fear, on souls. Once you step foot on it, it claims you." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he was saying. A curse? A portal? This was insane. "Mark, he's gone," Greg continued, his voice hollow. "He's part of the island now." I felt sick, my stomach twisting into knots. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. "We have to leave," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We have to get out of here." Greg shook his head. "It's too late." That night we tried to escape, but the island wouldn't let us. The moment we stepped outside, the fog closed in around us, thicker than before, suffocating. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling the air with their dark, twisted words. As we ran, the ground beneath our feet seemed to shift, moving like liquid. The trees twisted and contorted, their branches reaching out to grab us, their bark splitting open to reveal dark, gaping mouths. The island was alive, hungry, and it wanted us. We reached the dock, but the boat was gone. The water churned violently, waves crashing against the rocks, as though the sea itself was trying to swallow the island whole. And then out of the fog, Mark appeared. His eyes were black now, empty voids that seemed to suck in the light. His skin was pale, almost translucent, his veins dark and swollen. He smiled at us, a cold, lifeless smile. "You can't leave," he said, his voice a hollow echo. "The island won't let you." The ground beneath us began to crack, the earth splitting open, revealing a dark, endless void. The whispers grew deafening, filling my head with their terrible, twisted words. I felt myself being pulled toward the darkness, my body shaking as though something was trying to drag me down. And then, everything went black. Epilogue: The Island's Whisper. When I woke, I was alone. The mansion was gone, the island silent. The fog had lifted, revealing a barren, desolate landscape. The trees were dead, their twisted branches bare. The air was still, too still. But the whispers, they were still there, faint but ever present. I am the only one left, but I know the island is watching, waiting. It has claimed me, just as it claimed Mark and Greg and all those before us. And one day it will come for me, because the island never forgets, and it is always hungry. If the darkness has already sunk its claws into you, there's only one way to survive the night. Subscribe to Nightmare Narratives and hit the notification bell, because the nightmares here are far from over. And trust me, the next one won't wait for you to be ready. You'll want to be the first to know when the shadows start whispering again.